Good afternoon, everyone, and my name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another in our series of NRL live streaming sessions. Every other week on Wednesdays at this same time, we will discuss a new topic, and we want to encourage you to provide us with as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. And I just wanted to pass along the number to call or text us at, and it's 1-844-424-0500. That's 1-844-424-0500. We are doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public get a better understanding of what is involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and encourage viewers and listeners to participate in both of these activities. With me today is my usual co-host, Mr. 𝗗𝗲𝘁𝗶𝗹. Qasim is the project co-lead for the Northern Road Link project. Good afternoon, Qasim.
Good afternoon, Don. Great to be back again with our audience this week.
Great to have you back. We had a great week last week with a couple of open house sessions, which were a lot of fun, and we got some good questions and comments, which I think were helpful for sure to the project. So let's just to give everyone a bit of a background of today's session. The session's called the Federal Impact Assessment Process, um, and and it's focusing on the initial project description, or what we call the IPD. And this is sort of the first report or deliverable that's prepared as part of what we call the planning phase of the impact assessment process. And as a bit of a background, the federal impact assessment process is the responsibility of the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, also known as IAC. So if our team can bring up the presentation for us on the screen, great. Maybe Qasim, you can run through the many topics we're going to cover today.
Absolutely, Don. So today, we take a deep dive into the first part of the planning phase. Before we do that, let's start with an overview of the main phases in the impact assessment process. Then talk a little bit about phase one, which is planning. Then we talk about the key theme for today, which is the initial project description, or step one in phase one. Within that, we talk about the project, well, different components of the IPD, starting with the project, its proponents in this case, and previous activities. We discuss activities associated with the project. That's a component of the IPD, anticipated emissions, discharges, and waste. Another component of the IPD is project alternatives, land, water use, and land ownership. Then we jump into a discussion on permits, licenses, and authorizations required, followed by potential environmental effects. And then the last topic within the IPD, which is proponent engagement and consultation. We leave the discussion with our contact information, of course. So those listening to us have easy access to contact information if they have any feedback or comments related to the project.
Thank you, Qasim. Let's start now with a high-level view of the overall impact assessment process, and then we'll work through the IPD itself as part of the first phase, the planning phase, and get into more specifics. So there's 5 phases involved in the impact assessment process. The first is the planning phase, which is where we currently are on the NRL project. That's followed by the impact statement phase, where a lot of the work is being done by the proponent, conducting the studies, gathering data and information, and putting that material together. And then the third phase is called the impact assessment phase, where that impact statement generated in phase 2 is essentially analyzed and synthesized to develop the impact assessment, which then goes to the decision-making phase, phase 4, where the minister or governor and council will render a decision on based on the impact assessment that they have reviewed. And then the post-decision phase refers to the time where you're getting monitoring and compliance activities undertaken. So those are the 5 main phases. And maybe, Qasim, you can kick things off by starting with a discussion of that first phase planning to show our viewers and listeners the process context that the IPD sits within.
And that's an important piece, Don, which is, what does that overall phase one entail? Now, let's start with the description of phase one that IAC provides itself. IAC describes it as a phase in which the public and indigenous people are invited to provide information and contribute to planning the assessment. Now, it's got 4 different stages, if you might. The first one, which we do a deep dive on today, is the initial project description, which is first prepared by the proponent. That's followed by a phase known as the detailed project description. That's another deliverable prepared by the proponent directly. Then, after that, the agency determines if an impact assessment is required. And that is why, Don, we're never really able to say at this initial stage that an impact assessment is required. We believe it is required, but the way the process is structured, we need to go through the first deliverables within the planning phase, the IPD and the DPD. And after that, we get this notice of determination from the agency, which says an impact assessment is required. Now, other proponents might get the opposite of that, which says an impact assessment is not required, and they can sort of go on to other processes. But in our case, our assumption is that it would be required. And if the agency determines it is required, then they issue what's known as the tailored impact statement guidelines. They prepare them themselves. So this is a deliverable which the agency prepares and they produce and they issue it to the proponent. And it acts like a work plan for the rest of the process. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that in the future. But let's get back to talking a bit more about the initial project description.
Thank you, Qasim. And if our team can move to slide 5, please. I'll talk a little bit about the IPD, the initial project description, and where it sits in that process. So the IPD provides information about the project, and the information requirements for that IPD are prescribed by IAC. So they have expectations as to the nature of and extent of information they require for that document. The IPD, once it's accepted by IAC, then goes on to what is called the registry, which is basically making that document public and available to members of the public to access and review on their own. IAC then engages and consults with provincial, territorial, and Indigenous jurisdictions, Indigenous groups, federal authorities, and other participants and stakeholders, and then all that input is assembled and boiled down to what's called a summary of issues, and this summary of issues is then used to guide the preparation of the detailed project description, which is sort of the next step in that evolution of the description of the project. So that's sort of where it sits into the process. Qasim, let's start looking now at the components of an IPD, because there's a number of components, and I'll get into this in more detail, but the idea is to sort of break that project down into finer detail. So I'll pass that over to you. It's slide number 6 for our technical team.
Yeah, so even though the document is called an initial project description, There's a lot of detail that goes into an initial project description, and the first one is a very handy dandy summary component of the IPD, which helps describe the project, starting with what is the project, what is it meant to do, what is the purpose of the project, including a descriptive account of a project like the Northern Road Link, which includes a description of the width of the right of way. The right of way is where the area on which the road itself would go, the length of the road, other infrastructure components that are required. And as part of a road, you've got bridges, culverts, laydown areas, camps required during construction, aggregate pits and quarries required both for construction but for ongoing maintenance. And then those areas might be a little farther away from the road itself, so you need access roads to get to aggregate sites and quarries. So those are all sort of other infrastructure components, and then a description of the geographic setting of the project. So all that description, that descriptive account, is the first part of an IPD. It also describes who the proponents are. So in this case, the indigenous proponents are Martin Falls First Nation and 𝗬𝗶𝗁𝗶 First Nation. So this document describes the nature of the proponents. Uh, it also discusses previous engagement and consultation. Now, Don, you and I have been doing this live stream since I believe last summer, early last summer. And looking out the window, it's not the coolest day we've had this winter. I like to think it's a sign of things to come, which is the spring's almost here. Which also means that we're getting close to about a year of engagement and consultation on the project. And fortunately, we've heard from many people from different communities, from members of the public, from uh, different government agencies and ministries. So we take that and we describe the previous engagement and consultation that was done and what we've heard to date. Then we also describe previous environmental studies that have been conducted either by the project itself, or if others have done other studies in the past, we start with the description of that. So that's the first sort of handy dandy component of the IPD. If anyone is looking to sort of review or just remind themselves of what the project is, reading that chapter is always very helpful.
I agree, Qasim, and so what we're seeing here is we're trying to set the scene with regard to this project, to start breaking it down and fleshing out this project so that the regulators and the general public can get a clear idea of what the project entails. So that's sort of where we're moving with this in this document, looking at the different components. And let's move now to another key information component of the IPD, and that's project activities. And this is an important one. Um, what happens here is the project is basically dissected into and sort of broken down into all the activities that would be associated with it at different points in time, whether it's during construction, whether it's during operations and maintenance, or in the actual use of the road or access to the road. So, for example, construction activities, you'd have, at the outset, you'd have activities such as clearing of vegetation. You might start the construction of the bridges, surveying, laying out the right of way, aggregate extraction and production, uh, moving earth and aggregate to build the road. So, uh, I forgot to mention this earlier, developing access roads to be able to get access to the aggregate in order to build the road. And then operations, maintenance, and storage of machinery and equipment, laydown areas, equipment laydown areas, material laydown areas. These all require space. They're all requirements of the project. and on a temporary basis in most cases. Sometimes there might be a permanent area for storage of maintenance vehicles and equipment, but most of these are temporary. There's construction monitoring activities associated with the project. There's site restoration activities that go on, where when a facility that is only temporary is no longer required, such as a construction camp anymore, they have to then try to restore the area as close as possible to the way it was before. And then on the operations and maintenance side, there's activities like road surface repair, so spot repairs along the road. Um, there's resurfacing of the entire road or sections of the road with new gravel. There's dust control when you go through dry periods. There's vegetation and brush control to ensure that vegetation and brush don't interfere with the movement of vehicles along the road. And then, of course, snow clearing and de-icing in some cases. And then on the road use or access control side, there's the enforcement, there's the policing, there's access to and use of adjacent lands for traditional uses or other activities. So there's a number of different activities. And again, what we're doing is adding more detail about this project, breaking it down to the individual activities. And then as you'll see as we move through the presentation, we look at those activities and then reflect on those activities and identify more detail beyond that. So um, with all these activities, there is waste or emissions associated with them. Um, and maybe, Qasim, you can take us through how these are addressed in the IPD.
And that just speaks to the level of detail that goes into the overall process, I think, Don. The fact that, we start to look at anticipated emissions, discharges, and waste and associated management practices with all of these emissions. And the first time I think people see that, many people are pleasantly surprised to see the level of detail, analysis, and thought, and sort of just breaking it down to such small components that goes into an impact assessment process. So from the construction stage, if you think about activities that take place, heavy equipment that's on site, there's waste oil associated with that, there's solid waste associated with construction activities, there's equipment and vehicle noise emissions. And even though this is a remote part of Ontario, and we don't have immediate neighbors, but 𝗬𝗶𝗁 and Martin Falls are right there. So those community members go out on this land frequently, particularly around the traditional hunt seasons in the spring and the fall. So they might say to us that we do that, and we don't want that adversely or negatively impacted. So we might create a management practice around that to ensure that we're mindful of those timing windows, equipment isn't utilized that makes a lot of noise, and we mitigate it in different ways. So that is an associated management practice that tags along with every single source of anticipated emission, discharge, and waste. Similarly, with air emissions from exhaust of vehicles and equipment during construction and operation, most projects would talk about decommissioning as well. With the Northern Road Link, we don't anticipate decommissioning in the foreseeable future. We think it'll be a permanent infrastructure piece in Martin Falls and 𝗬𝗶𝗁 traditional territory. Then we look at GHG emissions, or greenhouse gas emissions, which is a function of activities like land clearing, biomass burning. If someone's burning even wood pallets to heat up a camp or something, loss of peatlands and wetlands, another important element for the geography of this project, emissions from construction camps and exhaust emissions. So we talk about all of these things, the anticipated impact from all of these activities, but more interestingly, associated management practices. At the open house, Don, we spoke about innovative ways in which we can tackle issues related to, for example, the excavation of peatlands and wetlands. That there's this thought that, we're removing peatlands and wetlands to be able to build a road over there. And that's not the case. And our engineering lead spoke to innovative ways like a geotextile that helps us create sort of a floating road so you don't displace wetland or peatland features. You build on top. So those plans enable us to manage and minimize greenhouse gas emissions, things like dust emissions, erosion and sedimentation of banks or the land as a result of this development, slash and root waste from clearing and grubbing operation, and unsuitable construction material which might be encountered like poor soils. And then how do you manage for that? So all of that would be described in the IPD. And I almost think that that word initial sounds maybe a little misleading because that's a lot of detail.
Yes. Makes you wonder what's in the detailed, but our viewers will find that out in 2 weeks, Qasim. So no, great points, and just to add to that, and just sort of underline my point that I've been making through the presentation is, you know, look at what this document, in terms of what we've talked about so far. We've identified the project in general. We've identified the proponent. We've identified the infrastructure components involved. We've identified the activities associated with the construction of those infrastructure components, with the operation of the actual road as well. And then we've taken those activities and we've looked at those activities and we've identified the sources of the waste and the emissions and potential ways that they can be dealt with. So we're breaking this down into this, a much more detailed description of the project as we move through and satisfy these information requirements. So, okay, let's take a look at some of the other information requirements of the IPD, those being project alternatives, land and water use, and land ownership. So if our team can switch to slide, there we are. So this is another information requirement. So if there have been alternative routes identified, this information must be included as part of this document. If there are if there's enough information, enough background studies that have been done to identify where potentially construction camps might be, or aggregate source locations and associated infrastructure, whether it's access roads or crossing structures, then these should be identified. In terms of land and water use, looking at the area, the land in the area, there may be mining claims. There's been, in terms of this project area, there has been quite a bit of development work, exploration work, or more exploration work than development work in the area. So there's been a number of mining claims made in the area. Both communities that are have been involved in the community-based land use project. So they've looked at their land and identified areas and maybe not to a final version, but they've earmarked certain lands for different activities as well too. And then looking at use by neighboring First Nations. Would they be using these lands from time to time? Are these shared traditional lands? Trying to identify all that kind of information. And then land ownership itself, whether they're crown lands, whether they're reserve lands, which would fall under federal jurisdiction as well. So there's, again, a lot of information required as part of this document. And Qasim, maybe you can talk a little bit about another information requirement, and that's potential permits, licenses, and authorizations that might be required.
Yeah, so as part of the IPD, we're required to describe the different permits, licenses, and authorizations that might be required for the project and its related activities. In our case, a lot of the work that happens to collect, for example, in this stage, baseline information and data requires permits, licenses, and authorizations at the provincial level. But there are three key agencies with which we need to interact to ensure that we are not we're not sort of impacting any of those features. And if we are to seek and to confirm if permits, licenses, and authorizations required. So it starts with Transport Canada under the Navigation Protection Act. And if we believe or we think there's any chance of us impacting the navigable waterways or water bodies, if we may interfere substantially with navigation, think of, for example, construction of a bridge, a dam, causeway, if you believe you'll be dumping any fill or excavation of materials from the riverbeds, which is typically things that are done for the placement of a power cable at a riverbed. Those type of activities could impact the navigation of waterways either temporarily or on a longer term basis. So if that is anticipated based on the Navigation Protection Act, you need to get in touch with Transport Canada and seek permits, licenses, and authorizations as required. So that would be described. Similarly, from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, an authorization under Fisheries Act is required if you believe there's going to be serious harm to fish that are part of a commercial, recreational, or indigenous fishery, or to fish that support such a fishery. So, in the case of any serious harm anticipated, uh, proponents have to be in touch with Fisheries and Oceans Canada to seek authorization under the Fisheries Act. And then the last one for proponents of a project of this sort relates to permits associated with Species at Risk Act from Environment and Climate Change Canada. And those could be species that are terrestrial, avian, or aquatic. And if there's any sort of impact considered on the species or the critical habitat required for it, we're required to seek permits, licenses, and authorizations as they might be applicable. So think of caribou, for example, a common example that comes up. But that is a species on which we also conduct baseline studies to understand the population, the habitat, the movements, the current strength of the habitat over there, as well as the population. So all of that, even though it's just a study of it might be an observational study, but if we're doing even activities of that sort, we are required to go and check for applicable permits, licenses, and authorizations, Don. And all of that is described in the initial project description.
Thank you for that, Qasim. And another information requirement of the IPD is potential environmental effects. And I thought I'd run through these. There we are, slide number 11. So as part of this section, there's sort of a scene setting that occurs in terms of the vegetation, the superficial geology, the hydrology, wildlife, fisheries, climate, and just the uses, the human uses of the land in that region. So having identified potential project activities, to a fairly high level of detail, the proponent is required to describe potential effects on fish and fish habitat, on aquatic plants, on migratory birds as defined by the federal legislation, and any environmental changes that may occur on federal lands or in other neighboring provinces or even outside of Canada. And of course, another key set of effects that need to be identified is are the effects on Aboriginal peoples from changes to the environment as a result of doing the project, of carrying out the project. So that's the potential. That's sort of those are the potential environmental effects that need to be identified as part of the IPD. And Qasim, we're almost at the end of our session, but information on proponent engagement and consultation with Aboriginal groups or Indigenous groups, the public, other stakeholders, and government agencies is another requirement of the IPD and a key requirement. Can you maybe run through these for us?
It absolutely is, Don. It's probably the most important part of the project, especially for an Indigenous proponent like Martin Falls and Webber. So all engagement and consultation done with Aboriginal groups, we have to provide a summary of past consultation on related projects, key issues that were raised previously, proposed methods of consultation that communities have talked to us about, collection and use of indigenous knowledge, how we intend to do that, what the process might be, and how we will come to reflect that in the impact assessment. And also a summary of consultation activities and events conducted to date. Similar things would also be done to describe consultation with the public and other stakeholders, and last but certainly not the least, consultation with government agencies, which happens across the board, from provincial ministries and agencies to federal agencies and ministries. So that is described in the consultation and engagement part of the IPD, Don.
So long story short, Qasim, the initial project description is very deceiving. Initial suggests that it may not be very detailed, but it's actually quite detailed, isn't it?
I think that's a good takeaway, Don, which is that, for our listeners, we're thinking about an initial project description being a 1 page or 2 pager. It's actually a really deep document, and when you dig into it, you realize that you walk away with way more information
Yeah.
than the word initial might suggest. But that's just a little pun on the naming convention of this project. It really is kickstarting such a comprehensive process. And this is the first one of the first conversations on it on this forum. But we've been talking about this for a year with communities, and there'll be so many more conversations related to that. So hopefully, when you see the IPD, it will be an indicator of conversations to come in the future.
I think that's a great way to describe it, Qasim. And that wraps up today's NRL discussion. That was a good one. There was a lot of material to cover in a short period of time, as always. And thank you, Qasim, for sharing your thoughts on this. The IPD is a key deliverable in the federal impact assessment process, and I hope our viewers and listeners got a better idea of what's involved in the IPD. And as we prepare to finalize that document for the Northern Road Link project. Join us again in 2 weeks when we continue our discussion on the federal impact assessment process. And this time we are going to talk about the DPD, the detailed project description. So we think the IPD is detailed, Qasim. That DPD has got to be really detailed. It has to be. So anyway, we look forward to talking to you again in 2 weeks. Please don't forget to visit our website at northernroadlink.ca or follow us on social media at NRL Roadlink. And we look forward to seeing you again. And take care, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Miigwech. Thank you, Qasim.
Thank you, Don.